Mercy Watson, Something Wonky This Way Comes, written by Kate DiCamillo and illustrated by Chris Van Dusen. Chapter 1. Mr. Watson and Mrs. Watson have a pig named Mercy. Mr. Watson, Mrs. Watson, and Mercy live together in a house at 54 Deckaroo Drive. One Saturday afternoon, Mr. Watson said to Mrs. Watson, "My darling, my dear, there's a movie at the Bijou called When Pigs Fly." "When Pigs Fly," said Mrs. Watson. "What an inspiring title! Mercy, did you hear?" Mercy did not hear. Mercy did not hear because Mercy was not listening. "It says here that the Bijou proudly serves real butter," said Mr. Watson. "Oh my," said Mrs. Watson, "real butter." Mercy pricked up her ears. She was listening now. Mercy loved butter. She particularly loved butter on hot toast, but she would take butter any way she could get it. "Yes," said Mr. Watson, "it says here that the Bijou proudly serves real butter on every bottomless bucket of popcorn." "Bottomless?" said Mrs. Watson. "Bottomless," said Mr. Watson, which means all you can eat. "All you can eat," said Mrs. Watson. "What a delightful concept." Mercy thought that all you can eat was a very delightful concept. "Let's go to the movies," said Mr. Watson. "Let's," said Mrs. Watson. "Oink," said Mercy. Chapter 2. "Where are you going?" said Baby Lincoln. "We're off to the movies," said Mr. Watson. "Oh," said Baby, "what movie are you going to see?" "It is a movie called When Pigs Fly," said Mrs. Watson. "Is it a romance?" said Baby. "Is it a movie about love?" "Well," said Mrs. Watson, "I think it is basically a movie about pigs flying." "Don't be ridiculous," said Eugenia Lincoln. "Pigs don't fly. It's a figure of speech." "What's a figure of speech?" said Mr. Watson. "The movie title," said Eugenia, "is a figure of speech signifying the impossible." "Well," said Mrs. Watson, "we are going to be impossibly late if we don't get going." "Would you care to join us?" said Mr. Watson. "Yes," said Baby Lincoln. "Absolutely not," said Eugenia Lincoln. "Oh, sister," said Baby, "please say yes." "No," said Eugenia. But she got into the Watsons' convertible anyway. "Where are you going?" shouted Stella. "We're off to the movies," said Mr. Watson. "What kind of movie are you going to see?" said Frank. "It's a romance," said Baby. "It will be inspirational," said Mrs. Watson. "It's a figure of speech," shouted Eugenia. "Is it a movie with a happy ending?" said Frank. "Oh, it must end happily," said Mrs. Watson. "Can we come too?" said Stella. "The more the merrier," said Mr. Watson. Chapter 3. Police Officer Tomalolo had the night off. Officer Tomalolo was at the Bijou Drive-In. He was with his wife, Mrs. Officer Tomalolo. They were in the front row. "Is it nice to have a night off from the relentless duties of keeping the world safe from crime?" Officer Tomalolo asked himself. "It is nice," he answered himself. "It is very nice." Mrs. Officer Tomalolo smiled. Mrs. Officer Tomalolo patted Officer Tomalolo's arm. Animal Control Officer Francine Powlett was at the Bijou Drive-In, too. Animal Control Officer Francine Powlett was with Alfred P. Tompkins. Alfred P. Tompkins and Francine Powlett were on a date. "Do you think that there will be actual pigs in this movie?" said Francine Powlett. "I'm not certain," said Alfred P. Tompkins. "As an animal control officer," said Francine Powlett, "I have found pigs to be the wiliest clients of all." "Really?" said Alfred. "Absolutely," said Francine. "Although I did catch a pig once. At least, I think I caught a pig." "Fascinating," said Alfred P. Tompkins. "Simply fascinating." He put his arm around Francine Powlett. Chapter 4. Leroy Ninker was a small man with a big dream. Leroy Ninker wanted to become a cowboy. But for now, Leroy was working at the Bijou Drive-In concession stand. Leroy Ninker was selling bottomless buckets of popcorn. "Yippee-yi-yo!" he shouted. "There's nothing faux. That's right, it's real butter, folks. Top quality, bottomless, and out of this world. Yippee-yi-yo!" In between pouring butter and popping popcorn, Leroy Ninker was working on his lasso skills. He twirled a lasso, he made the lasso whistle, he lassoed a bottomless bucket. He lassoed a stool. Yippee-yi-yo, sang Leroy. There's nothing faux about my skill with a lasso. Chapter 5. The Watson convertible pulled up to the bijou ticket window. Help you? Said ticket seller Beatrice Leah Paglioni. We are here to see When Pigs Fly, said Mr. Watson. Beatrice Leah Paglioni took her glasses off. She put her glasses back on. She blinked. Pardon me and all, said Beatrice Leah Paglioni, but I'm seeing things kind of wonky. Is that a pig in the back seat of your vehicle? Her name is Mercy, said Mr. Watson. She is our darling, our dear, said Mrs. Watson. I'm not sure pigs are allowed at the bijou, said Beatrice Leah Paglioni. Actually, said Mr. Watson, she is a porcine wonder. Do you allow porcine wonders? Porcine wonders, said Beatrice Leah Paglioni. Yes, said Mrs. Watson. Beatrice Leah Paglioni blinked. I don't think there are any rules against porcine wonders, she said. Excellent, said Mr. Watson. Good evening to you, then. Beatrice Leah Paglioni blinked again. She adjusted her glasses. Wonky, said Beatrice Leah Paglioni. Wonky in the extreme. Chapter 6. Mercy put her snout up in the air. She sniffed. There was a wonderful smell. There was an incredible smell. The wonderful, incredible smell was everywhere. The wonderful, incredible smell was butter. Mr. Watson said, I think it's time for a bottomless bucket. Frank, why don't you and I go get some treats for the ladies? At the concession stand, the little man behind the counter said, Yippee-yi-yo, what do you know? Hey, said Mr. Watson, you're the man who robbed us. Robbed you? Said Frank. Yes, said Mr. Watson. He tried to take our toaster. My name is Leroy Ninker, said the little man. You're a thief, said Frank. Reformed, said Leroy Ninker. I'm a reformed thief studying to be a cowboy. Well, good for you, Mr. Ninker, said Mr. Watson. We would like several bottomless buckets. Butter on those buckets, said Leroy. We would like a great deal of butter on those buckets, said Mr. Watson. Yippee-yi-yo, said Leroy. That's the way to go. Chapter 7. The smell of butter was absolutely everywhere. The smell of butter was driving Mercy wild. Where was the butter smell coming from? Mercy thought she would go and investigate. She leaped out of the convertible. She moved with purpose. Was there anything more heavenly than being hot on the trail of a true butter smell? Mercy did not think so. She trotted faster. Mercy Watson was a pig on a mission. Chapter 8. Hey now, said Alfred P. Tompkins. Speaking of pigs, isn't that a pig right there? Where? Said Francine Powlett. There, said Alfred P. Tompkins. He pointed at the truck that was trotting past the truck. He pointed at the pig that was trotting past the truck. The pig had its snout up in the air. The pig looked very happy. That, said Francine Powlett, is the pig from Deckaroo Drive. I have dealt with that pig before. I wonder what a pig is doing at the movies, said Alfred P. Tompkins. That is a good question, said Francine. That's the kind of question that only an animal control officer can answer. Fascinating, said Alfred P. Tompkins. Don't make any sudden movements, said Francine Powlett. She reached into the back of her truck. She grabbed her net. If you want to see an animal control officer in action, said Francine Powlett, follow me. Fascinating, said Alfred P. Tompkins. Simply fascinating. I'm right behind you. Chapter 9. Mercy stopped. She sniffed. The smell of butter was very strong. The smell of butter was very near. The smell of butter was coming from the back seat of a station wagon. Mercy stuck her head in the window. She sniffed again. The smell of butter was coming from an extremely large bucket in the hands of a very small child. Mercy helped herself. The small child screamed, "Papa, Papa, a monster is eating my popcorn!" Mercy chewed. The popcorn was drenched in butter. It was delicious. A man stuck his face in Mercy's snout. "What do you think you're doing?" the man said. What did Mercy think she was doing? She thought she was enjoying a buttery snack. "Get out of there!" shouted the man. He gave Mercy a very forceful shove. Popcorn went flying everywhere. Mercy thought that perhaps it was time to move on. Chapter 10. In the front row of the Bijou drive-in, Officer Tomalolo sat straight in his seat. Officer Tomalolo said, "Did you hear that?" Mrs. Officer Tomalolo said nothing. "Was that a scream of distress?" said Officer Tomalolo. "It sounded like a scream of distress," he answered himself. "Is someone in trouble?" Officer Tomalolo asked. Mrs. Officer Tomalolo said nothing. "It is very possible that someone is in trouble," Officer Tomalolo answered himself. "Is it time for an officer of the law to step in?" Officer Tomalolo asked. "Most definitely," he answered. Officer Tomalolo put his badge around his neck. He got his bullhorn from the back seat. He kissed Mrs. Officer Tomalolo goodbye. He said, "Am I off to make the world a safer place?" "I am," he answered himself. "I am most definitely off to make the world a safer place." Mrs. Officer Tomalolo waved goodbye. Chapter 11. Mercy discovered that there was hot buttered popcorn everywhere. Every car had big buckets of popcorn. Every car had open windows. The popcorn was buttery, the popcorn was crunchy, the popcorn was delicious. Mercy helped herself. She helped herself again and again. People screamed, people laughed, people fainted. Mercy kept eating. In the meantime, Mr. Watson and Frank returned to the convertible with several bottomless buckets of popcorn. Mrs. Watson was crying. "My darling, my dear," said Mr. Watson, "what is wrong?" "It's a tragedy," said Mrs. Watson. "I wouldn't exactly call it a tragedy," said Eugenia Lincoln. "Mercy is missing," said Stella. "Don't worry," said Mr. Watson. "We'll find her." "I'll wait here if you don't mind," said Eugenia Lincoln. She helped herself to some hot buttered popcorn. Chapter 12. Leroy Ninker heard people screaming about monsters. Leroy Ninker heard people shouting about pigs. Leroy Ninker saw a woman with a net run past the concession stand. "What are you trying to catch?" said Leroy Ninker. "A pig," said the woman with the net. "A pig?" said Leroy Ninker. "That's right," said the woman. "You're not going to catch livestock with a net," said Leroy Ninker. "What you need is a lasso. Yippee-yi-yo!" Mr. Watson and Mrs. Watson and Stella and Frank and Baby shouted, "Mercy! Mercy! Mercy!" "Should you remain calm?" Officer Tomalolo asked. "You most definitely should remain calm." At the ticket counter, Beatrice Leopaglione took her glasses off and put them back on. "Wonky," said Beatrice Leopaglione. "Wonky in the extreme. Maybe it's some kind of emergency. Maybe I should call for help." Beatrice Leopaglione adjusted her glasses. She picked up the phone. Beatrice Leopaglione dialed the fire department. Chapter 13. Mercy was having a wonderful time. She had consumed a large amount of buttered popcorn, and now people were chasing after her. Mercy loved a chase. She ran faster. She kicked up her heels. "Gotcha!" shouted Francine Powlett. Francine Powlett netted Officer Tomalolo. "Yippee-yi-yo!" shouted Leroy Ninker. He lassoed Francine Powlett. "Fascinating," said Alfred P. Tompkins. "Simply fascinating." There was the sound of a siren. There was the flash of lights. A fire truck pulled into the Bijou. "Things seem to be out of control," said the fireman named Ned. "It's the movies," said the fireman named Lorenzo. "They make people crazy." "Actually," said a man who was standing next to Ned, "I think the pig is making people crazy." "Holy smokes! I know that pig," said Lorenzo. "It's that toast-loving pig from Deckaroo Drive." "I'll tell you," said the man standing next to Ned. "This is way better than any movie I've ever seen. It's all been fascinating. Simply fascinating." "I guess it's time for us to come to the rescue," said Ned. We should do what only firemen can do, said Lorenzo. Ned and Lorenzo took off running. Ned and Lorenzo ran very fast. Ned and Lorenzo caught up with Mercy. Hey, said Ned, how's about some toast? Yes, said Lorenzo, how's about some toast with a great deal of butter? Mercy stopped running. Mercy sat down. Mercy thought very hard. Toast sounded like an excellent idea to her. Toast always sounded like an excellent idea to her. Ned sat down next to Mercy. He put his arm around her. Oh, said Mrs. Watson, you found her. How will we ever be able to thank you for helping us locate our darling, our dear, said Mr. Watson. Well, said Ned, I'm a little hungry. Toast would be good, said Lorenzo. Toast, said Mrs. Watson. I would love to make some toast. Who else would like some toast? We never did get to see that movie, said Stella. I wonder if it ended happily, said Frank. Well, said Mrs. Watson, here we are, all of us together, and we're all eating toast, said Mr. Watson. I can't imagine a happier ending than that, said Mrs. Watson. It's the happiest possible ending, said Baby Lincoln. It's almost like a love story. It is a love story, said Mr. Watson, and it's very inspirational, said Mrs. Watson. And it's very inspirational, said Mrs. Watson.